Yeah, and Crystal, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope that you've had a wonderful week this last week. Just as a note, I did pop into the learning objectives document that we've been working with, and I just added some comments. They were all really good learning objectives. I had some things for folks to think about as they kind of think about how they might develop learning objectives for their own trainings. And then again, recognizing these were hypotheticals, although some of you may actually be planning a training in the topic that you picked. But just would probably be a good idea to just kind of review that document and just kind of think about some of those, because actually a lot of the comments that I ended up making involved what we're going to talk about today. So hopefully that's kind of good food for thought. And today we're going to talk about measuring learning. And so for a good portion of this, I'm actually going to be talking at you a bit. But please, I have the chat open. It's actually on my main monitor. So if folks have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll be able to see it. I have you guys up on my screen. But I want to explain about some of the different ways that you can measure learning, and also just training effectiveness generally. And also think about how you might want to measure training in your measure learning in your context, and to think about how you might want to just think about what effectiveness looks like for what you're doing. So the first thing is how you measure success. The success of a training is going to depend on your goals. There's actually a lot of times we focus solely on outcome reporting, because we're kind of trained to do that in a way, right? A lot of grants are focused a lot on outcome reporting, but there's actually a lot of different ways that you can evaluate and to measure success in a training program. The first is informative evaluation. So you might do this before you even start creating a training program. You might start to ask questions like, is this training, is what I want to do possible? Is it feasible? Do I have enough resources to do so? Is it appropriate for the audience that I'm planning on reaching? And will people accept it, right? You may have the best training in the world, but if your audience is not receptive to it, there may be some additional work that you have to go through before you can really launch your training program. So this type of evaluation before you actually start an initiative or an intervention or a training program or anything like that is called formative evaluation, because you're evaluating as you're forming that plan. And then while you're actually going through the training, you or your intervention, however you want to look at it, you might also have some evaluation around process or implementation evaluation. This is going to be particularly important for those of you who are considering working on a training program where maybe multiple people are providing the same training to different groups. You want to ask yourself, am I training on the things that I think I'm training on? Because you might imagine if your training is supposed to be on X, but your trainers are actually ending up spending a lot of time on Y, if you measure whether people are learning about X, you might get a mismatch, right, of what people are learning and what you're actually training on and what you think that they should be able to do at the end of it. So process and implementation evaluation is really helpful to do as you've started to do the training, to ensure that you're sticking to what your learning objectives are, what your goals for the intervention are. And so some terms that may be helpful to know are things like fidelity evaluation or fidelity assessments. And that is, say you develop a training manual, right? You actually check to see, are your trainers following that training manual? So this is really helpful to do as you're going through your training program, to just check, am I staying in line? It's really easy to get off course. And then the thing that everybody knows, or that we talk about the most when we talk about evaluation or talking about measuring learning is this outcome. So are people learning what we think that they're learning, and how is this helping to meet immediate goals? So for instance, if I do a statistical training, those folks that are attending the training, they want to know how to learn, they want to know how to do a specific statistical analysis, right? Can they do that at the end of it? That's an outcome question. And so this is when we think about evaluation, typically that's kind of the thing that comes up the most is outcome and effectiveness evaluation. And then lastly, there's impact evaluation, which if you've worked in nonprofit space at all, this is also a really common thing to be talking about. So that's, how is this training or how is this intervention meeting my organization's long-term goals? So or helping trainees to meet theirs. So if your long-term goal is to increase the uptake of open science practices in Africa, then how is this training helping to lead that? How can we make those connections? But obviously, that's if you want to think about like outcome versus impact, I tend to think of outcome as like more localized. So it's really about the trainees in that program, and my impact I think about is like kind of more societal. So it doesn't have to be like societal big, it could be societal like your university. But so impact is kind of that population that you're hoping to eventually generalize to. So you've got more localized outcome, more kind of general impact evaluation. And so these are actually all kinds of questions that you can ask whenever you're thinking about how effective your training program is going to be, or how you want it to run, just generally what you want it to accomplish. And so today I am going to focus on the outcome and effectiveness part because that's the thing. Yeah, sure, I can put this. And remember that these slides are on the OSF, so you can also at any point check out those. Oh no, it's moved. I'll fix this link and re-upload it. But there's a nice document that the CDC usually uses there. So I'll fix that link. Good to know that that's not working anymore. It was working like last week. We'll focus today on outcome and effectiveness evaluation because that's the kind of evaluation you have like the most direct control over because you're the one that's more than likely developing your training objectives and the materials and all of that. And it is a thing that people ask about the most. But do remember that these other kinds of evaluation exist. And so there are a number of ways that you can measure training outcomes and effectiveness. I have them listed here. We're going to talk about each one of them, and this is where I'm going to be doing a lot of the chatting today. But please do, if you have questions in the chat or anything like that, please post them or raise your hand and we can chat about any of these in more detail. But we'll talk about each one of these. The first is talking about satisfaction. So this is like asking a question on a survey, and you've probably seen this before, like how satisfied were you with this training? Or it could be a question like, would you recommend this training to other people? Would you take this training again? Was this training worth your time? So questions that are about like how happy people are generally with that with their training. And so generally this is like the minimum expected information from funders or from people who might be interested in taking the training, people who might be interested in purchasing a training. They generally want to know if people are going through this training, are they happy with the training? So that's generally the minimum expected information. It's also pretty fairly easy to measure and to standardize across trainings if you're running a bunch of different trainings. Even something that's as direct as like, if you had the chance, would you take this training again? Or would you recommend this training to somebody else? You can ask that for any kind of training, right? And you can be direct about it. So it's fairly easy to measure. It's information that everybody wants to know. And it can give you can ask more detailed questions that can give important feedback on format, delivery, and content, right? Like, so you can ask people, was this content relevant to you? Did you like the format? Were the slides easy to read? Like, you can ask those kinds of questions and say, like, just how satisfied are people with how this training was delivered, what the information was in it? Did you feel like everything was covered that you needed covered? You can ask these kinds of questions pretty simply. And then also it's the only way of getting feedback on some aspects of the training, like accessibility. So especially for folks that are really interested in making sure that their trainings are accessible to folks with different kinds of disabilities. It can you know, asking, was the information on the slide easy to read and all of that kind of stuff. That might be the only way that you can actually get feedback on some aspects of your training. And then also just generally, like it's good to know that people didn't think that going to your training was a waste of time. It's nice to know that people thought that the training was worthwhile. And if you've asked the questions in a good way, it can provide immediate actionable feedback. So if someone says, actually, it was really hard to read the text on your slides, you know exactly what you need to do, right? I need to review my slides and I need to make sure that the text on them is legible. So you can, you know, mess with the font sizes, or you can put fewer words on there, right? There are things that you can actually do to improve that. So a lot of times this can provide some really nice feedback that you can actually do something about, that is directly related to your training and not to outside contexts. On the other hand, satisfaction is also probably the least interesting thing to measure, because you're just asking if people thought the training was good. And most of the time, at least in US and Europe contexts, people will say this is fine. It's pretty rare. I mean, you might get one or two people that say, like, this is the best training that I've ever had. You might get one or two people that say, like, this is the worst training that I've ever had. But, like, generally speaking, most people seem to find that most training is fine. So it's not something that you want to hinge your entire success of your training on, because it's not a useful training outcome in the sense that it doesn't tell you whether people actually learned anything. And again, most people are going to find your training to be fine. So it's not super exciting as a topic to cover. But I would ask at least one or two questions that kind of get at this. Do folks have questions about measuring satisfaction? Remember, if you do, please do use the chat, raise your hand, happy to chat about it more. Another thing that can be useful to measure are attitudes and values. So you might want to see how people's perceptions of the topic have changed over time. This is also fairly easy to measure. It's a little bit harder than satisfaction because you want to get the wording just right. But generally speaking, like asking people, like, do you agree or disagree with these statements? Or, you know, do you feel positively or negatively about something? You can ask these kinds of questions fairly easy. They're fairly standard for most social science, behavioral science type surveys. So a lot of researchers are pretty familiar with asking these kinds of questions. And it's also good to know if people feel more positively about the stuff that we're teaching. They feel like it's valuable to engage in these practices. That's good for people to know. It's not learning, but it is something that is probably really helpful to know. But there are some considerations. There's something known as a ceiling effect that can happen. So this is where like a really high proportion of participants will rate the highest, so they'll strongly agree on something. So you might imagine, for instance, if you give a training on, say, preprints. If you do, let's say you ask people about their attitudes about preprints before the training and their attitudes about preprints after the training, it might be that the people are going to your training on preprints because they already feel really positively about it, right? They already feel preprints are important. I want to know more about preprints. I want to understand preprints. How do I do it? How can I maximize the utility, right, of my preprints? They already are going to rate it as being pretty high. Like, I strongly agree that preprints are important, or I really feel positively about preprints. And then afterwards, it might stay the same. And that's good. You don't want them to feel worse about preprints after your training, but it might not look like you've actually improved anything. So it's just something to kind of just note. It also, attitudes and values tend to serve more as kind of a mediator between training and behavior than like a primary outcome of itself. And what I mean by that is, if the goal is to ultimately get someone to, say, post a preprint, their attitudes towards posting a preprint are going to be important, right? If they don't think it's worth their time, if they don't think it's useful, they won't do it. But in and of itself, the attitude is not the thing that you want to change. The behavior is the thing that you want to change. So changing the attitude is an important step in changing the behavior, but it can't be that final outcome. For most types of training, you are actually trying to change a behavior. So changing the attitude helps get you part of the way there, but it doesn't get you all the way there. And so measuring attitudes and values can also be really important. And it could be good to have a couple questions on that, but it's not going to serve as your primary thing that you want to measure most of the time. There may be some cases, particularly maybe if one of your main goals of a training is to reduce stigma around something, maybe actually measuring attitudes and values might actually be a primary outcome in that sense. So I can imagine, for instance, maybe you have a training where one of your main outcomes is that you want people to feel more comfortable talking about mistakes that they've made within the research process, right? So you're wanting to reduce the stigma of people saying like, hey, I thought I was doing X and I totally ended up doing this other thing, and whoops. Mistakes happened, or I accidentally coded something wrong, and then it got published. And I had to do a correction. If part of that problem, or part of the thing that you're trying to fix is reducing stigma of that and making people feel more comfortable being open about talking about mistakes, then actually measuring attitudes and values may be something that you're primarily measuring. So it really, again, is context dependent, but like, I think especially for folks that are interested in, I want people to use open source tools, I want people to post preprints, I want people to pre-register. If you're trying to get people to engage in a behavior, attitudes and values get you part of the way there, but they don't get you all the way there. And then similarly, right, you can also measure people's confidence or self-efficacy. How confident do they feel that they can engage in those behaviors? It is good to know that people feel like they can do something after a training, right? I feel like I can mentor people in open science practice, or I feel like I can post a preprint on my own. I can find the right preprint server. All of that is, it's good to know that people feel like they can actually act. It's also fairly easy to measure. You can just ask people, do you feel like you can do this? It is a little bit harder than satisfaction and possibly harder than attitudes, because again, you do have to be pretty careful with how you word the questions, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it is still fairly, it's a lot easier than some of the other stuff that we're about to talk about. But some of those considerations are that confidence is not necessarily related to skill. For those of you who have been teaching a while, you've probably had your fair share of students come into the classroom going, well, I already know how to do all of this. I've got this down. And then they actually go through your class or your training, and then they realize like, oh, actually, no, I don't actually know what I'm doing, right? So confidence and skill are two different things. And so people can feel really confident about their ability to do something, but then when they actually sit down to do it, it's actually a lot harder than they think. So confidence is one thing to kind of, as you're talking about the results, being clear that there's a distinction between those two things. Confidence is also easily influenced by factors other than the training and the content. So I saw this a lot when I did evaluations for trainings in the healthcare setting. So in the US, the healthcare setting is a mess, frankly. There's a lot of, and maybe there's some similarities to folks in your local context, but hospitals are often, they're very busy. People are encouraged to not spend a whole lot of time with any particular patient. It can be really hard to do cross-team collaboration. There's, not a lot of consideration for, and this isn't true across all hospitals, but just as a general system, there's not a lot of consideration for like the well-being of folks that are working in the system. And so if you give a training to healthcare workers on how to talk to people on other teams, you can give them all the skills and everything that they want. But when they actually sit down, like, do I think that I can engage in these behaviors? A lot of times they rate their confidence as lower. It doesn't have anything to do with your training, actually. When you actually dig into it, they're like, I don't have time. We're understaffed. I don't have the capacity to do this, or the other department is also really busy and they're not trained on this. So like you can get into these other factors that are more situational, that are more environmental, that impact someone's confidence in their ability to engage in these behaviors, but it's actually not related to your training. Your training could have been perfect, right? But if they feel like their boss doesn't value this, or that their setting doesn't value this, they may still feel like they don't actually have a lot of power to engage in this behavior. So again, like with attitudes, it serves as more of a mediator between training and your primary outcome. So if you're wanting people to pre-register, knowing that they feel confident in their ability to pre-register is important, but the confidence itself is not going to be your primary outcome. So good to maybe have a couple questions on this, but it can't be the actual thing that you or it in most cases, it's not going to be the thing that you're actually primarily interested in measuring. There's also something called response shift bias that can happen. And what happens here is, if we take again the overconfident student, someone may come in, actually I see this most with data sharing. So folks who are interested in measuring data sharing or trying to get people to share data, sometimes people come in and say, oh, I know how to share my data. I've got this down. And then you give them the training and they realize like, oh, there's a lot of stuff that I wasn't actually considering. And so their confidence might actually go down, but it's not a bad case because they came into the training overconfident. And now they have probably a more accurate measure of their confidence in their ability to actually engage in that practice, because now they're considering additional things. Maybe before they weren't considering format or having metadata or, any of these other things that people often forget. So sometimes ratings will go down in confidence. And that makes your training look bad, but it might not actually be a bad outcome because people are starting to consider more things. And then, so there's a question in the chat about, do you think it's a good idea to provide trainings with the training material, let them discover the content, and then play the role of a training mediator? I think it really varies on your audience. So I've definitely taught groups of people where giving them the material, letting them read it over, and then having them come in and then like you guys discuss what it is that you're learning and what stood out. That works really well for some audiences, but I think for folks that are maybe earlier in their career, or maybe who don't have that self-confidence to be able to feel like, okay, I can just read this and get it, that can be a little bit harder for them to navigate those scenarios. So if you feel like your audience might not have the confidence to engage with the material, or they feel lost, it can be really helpful to have that more structured conversation during the training, or to introduce it in smaller bits. Whereas if you have a very experienced group, maybe you can say, and also a group that you feel like is actually going to do the reading, has the time to do so, has the interest to do so. You can give them that material, let them explore it at their own rate, and then kind of just serve as a conversation partner of sorts. Hopefully, let me know if that is where you were going with that question. One way around response shift bias is so there's two ways that you can measure. If you're doing like a pre-post sort of thing, you can ask people before training and ask people after training, and so you can see you can see like pre and post that way. That's where you often see the response shift bias happen. So one way that you can get around that is by only having a post test. And instead of asking, you would ask the questions twice, but with slightly different context. So for instance, if we're doing, I feel I have the confidence to, this is not a great wording question, but it works for this. I feel confident that I can post a preprint on the correct server. Instead of asking that pre and post, you would just have the post survey, and you would ask, now that I've undergone this training, I feel that I can post a preprint on the correct server. And then you ask them some other questions. And then you say, like, prior to this training, did you feel, do you feel like you would have been able to post a preprint on the correct server? And then that helps them to reflect on what they think they would have been able to do now that they know what actually that task actually entails. So you're asking it twice, but you're asking them, like, now that you've been through the training and before you went through the training, do you think you would have been able to do this? And so that can help them to evaluate their previous skill or their previous confidence with the knowledge that they now have. So this is called like a retrospective pre-post test. Excuse me. You don't always have to worry about this, but if you think that your audience might suffer from some overconfidence, it may be useful to just consider how you might ask that question. And you may still do like the pre-post thing anyway. Knowledge is probably the thing that people are going to be most interested in. Actually, it's probably knowledge and also behavior. It makes sense to link training with knowledge questions, right? It makes sense if you want people to learn things to then measure their learning. And it can also be helpful in forecasting the future quality of work. One of the things that I talk about when I, again, talk about data sharing is, you know, anybody can upload an Excel file or a CSV or something with data in it, right? Anybody can share data, probably. But if you want to share data well, that requires some additional knowledge. So if you know that people know things like, oh, I know what metadata is, right? I know what interoperability means. I know what accessibility means. I know what findability means. I know what reuse means. I know what licenses are, all of that kind of stuff. If they have that knowledge, that can kind of forecast, like, if this person knows how to do this, so their likelihood when they actually engage in that behavior is going to be that the quality is probably going to be higher than somebody that doesn't know all of this stuff. But there are also some drawbacks to measuring knowledge, or at least some things that you should consider while you're measuring it. In your evaluations, you need to clearly link the knowledge questions to your learning objectives. So those learning objectives that we've kind of been talking about over the last couple of weeks, right? You need to make sure that your knowledge questions, whatever, if you're quizzing them on something or they're taking a test or you're asking them to define something, all of those things that you said in your learning objectives, like that I'm going to measure that they can do, they need the way that you actually measure that needs to link to those learning objectives. So you don't want to quiz people on stuff that isn't a part of the learning objective. And you need to make sure that all the learning objectives are covered. Ideally, these measures are validated. That means that they've been, you know, tested and checked against common standards for high quality questions. That's not always a possibility, especially if you're training people, you know, kind of on a volunteer basis, and you're just trying to get people to, you know, you're not part of a big organization that has a lot of money and, you know, all of this stuff. You don't always have that luxury of making sure that the measures are validated or running a validation study yourself. And again, knowledge is not necessarily related to skill. I would say it's maybe a little bit more related to skill than confidence is, but you can know how to do something and not be able to do it. I know how to hit a tennis ball. I'm okay at it, but I'm not going to be at Wimbledon anytime soon, right? So just because you know how to do something doesn't mean that you're particularly skilled at it. But I would say probably knowledge is closer than confidence in terms of how closely those things are tied together. And then also some important domains of knowledge are notoriously difficult to measure. Creativity, for instance, very difficult to measure. And then easier way to measure knowledge are often less meaningful. So if we take this, for instance, with pre-registration, if you are just having someone do a pre-registration and you're measuring knowledge, then being able to define what a pre-registration is a good thing. it's also way less interesting than actually looking at the pre-registrations that they come up with, right? And again, knowledge is not necessarily related to skill. Maybe I know what a pre-registration is, but when I actually sit down to do a pre-registration, it's a completely different game, right? And we actually hear this a lot when folks are learning how to do pre-registrations. They say like, I thought I knew what a pre-registration was, and I understand I can tell you what a pre-registration is. I can tell you what the steps are. I can tell you what the form, how to find the right template. I can do all of that. But then actually sitting down and doing the pre-registration is harder because it takes a lot more knowledge. It takes content knowledge that's not necessarily related to the training. And it requires a lot of work, helpful work, but work nonetheless. So, some of the things that you might want to measure in terms of knowledge might actually be really difficult to measure. And some of the stuff that's a little bit easier just might not be as interesting. And also it requires more work from participants, if you're quizzing people, if you're giving them assignments and you're going to be grading them and all of that, that does require more work from your participants, and that can also impact response rates. So if you're doing a post survey, and you say, hey, I'd like you to define in your own words what a preprint is, you might get a lot of people skip that question, because they're not interested in necessarily getting quizzed at the end of their training. And so that can sometimes reduce response rates, at least for specific questions. And then more meaningful and useful forms of this kind of measurement require some kind of grading and feedback process, right? So if you're having people do a draft of a pre-registration, okay, great. What are you going to do with that draft? If it's going to be useful for the participants of your training, that means that you're reading these drafts of pre-registrations and providing feedback on them and answering questions and doing all of that, which is more time for you. That's not a reason to not do it, but it is something that you have to consider as you're planning a training out. So I want to pause there real quick and just, do folks have questions about anything? Are there thoughts that are bubbling up to the surface?
I have a small question that brings us back to the validation point. How important really is for like a survey or a tool to be validated in order for it to be like considered as a good tool for collecting data? Like, for example, is it easy? Let's say if you did a survey and you want to publish based on this survey, does it have to be validated before you can say that I could trust this survey? And what is exactly the concept of validation? Like, I'm always
Yeah.
struggling to understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, so part of the reason why it's hard to struggle, your struggle is a common one, and also one that I even struggle with, because there's a lot of different ways to validate. There's a lot of different terms for validation, and there's a lot of different opinions on validation. So validation is this idea that you're checking, or you're providing evidence that a survey or some kind of evaluation is measuring what it purports to measure. So you're checking for things like reliability. So if people are getting measured on something multiple times, it's measuring that same thing, and also accuracy and validity. But there's a bunch of different kinds of validity. So there's something called face validity, which is like I look at the questions and I feel like I understand. Like I'm not measuring something that I don't think that, like, I read the question and the question makes sense, is basically what face validity is. I think that oftentimes in terms of evaluation is one of the most important validities. And that's just, I don't know that there's like a standard that you set that against. It's something that people kind of just know when they see, right? If I see your questions and I'm like, yes, these questions make sense, I know what you're trying to get at, that's face valid. But then there's other statistical forms of validity where you're doing, test-retest reliability, and you're doing like split hat, like there's like a bunch of different statistical things that you can do to measure validity. And most measures, I would argue, at least in the social sciences, are are not validated in terms of when thinking about training evaluation. When you think about like personality tests and stuff like that, those kinds of tests undergo a lot more validation, although perhaps still less than what some people would like. I would say like if you step out of a research setting and you go more into an evaluation mindset, which is where I tend to take this, validation is often a helpful rhetorical tool. So when you're talking to researchers, being able to say, this is validated, that is helpful. But for me, an evaluation is only as useful as it is informative to the context that you're in. So there may be measures that are validated that have been published, but they don't make sense for your context. So why would you use them? So for me, it is more important that the questions make sense for the context that you are in, that they make sense for your audience, than it is for them to have some kind of statistical thing. That doesn't mean that you can't include information. You can, there's you can provide Cronbach's alpha if it's relevant. You can say that you've gotten the questions looked at by other people who are experts in the field. Like there's things that you can do to kind of show that you're being rigorous with how you're asking your questions. But like as a formal validation strategy, for me, I would say it's much more important. And if I were reviewing a paper, and I have actually made this comment on papers that evaluated training, it's much more important that the questions make sense for what it is that you said that you were training. And sometimes there just aren't measures that are already validated in a topic area. So you can align with what other people have done. You can, if you have the time, the capacity, you can validate a measure. But it does take a lot of effort, and sometimes I think the utility of validation is less than it could be, because if you're really trying to focus on the context there. So evaluators and researchers tend to kind of disagree on this a bit. Researchers want things to be evaluated, or they want things to be validated, they want things to be standardized, they want all that. Evaluators are more focused on context. So there are evaluation journals that, and I'm happy to share those too. There are evaluation journals where somebody can publish an evaluation, and you're probably not going to get a whole lot of questions about validation. There may be some other questions that people might ask that are kind of related to that, but it's more about the rigor of the measure than it is about like, have you met this like specific standard, like these things that you need to report. But the more research oriented folks are probably going to have more questions about that. Yeah, so yes, like this child functioning module, right, can be useful for collecting disability data, and that can be used in a variety of contexts. But there may be some other stuff. I think in training, because topics vary so much and modality changes so much and audience changes so much, it's a lot harder to find like a standardized survey that somebody can give. Yeah, so yes, yeah, knowing your audience's learning needs helps you to do that evaluation more appropriately than my social science training. It's like hearing it in the back of my head. You're telling them not to validate. You can validate if you want. But I think from an evaluation standpoint, focus much more on like, are you learning what you need to learn to be able to improve your training? And then you can report those learnings out. But yeah, so that's a great question. And the comments in the chat, you guys have got it. That it really, you have to know your audience to be able to evaluate that properly. So yeah. Yeah, so great question. Any others before I get into, I think the next one's behavior. So that one's that one's a little complicated too. All right. So, oh yes, last point about knowledge. Knowledge degrades over time without review, which I think we all know this from any time we've had for me, it's like anytime I step away from R for like 6 months, I have to like re-go through all the documentation to like learn what I'm even supposed to type. So knowledge degrades over time without review. So if you're evaluating people on their knowledge like right after the training, that ends up, you get one set of information. If you ask them 6 weeks later, 6 months later, their knowledge is more than likely going to decline unless they're reviewing that information regularly. Oh yes, actually, so we're gonna split behavior up into two things. One is behavioral intention, and the other is actual behavior. So let's chat a little bit about behavioral intention. It's fairly easy to measure. Are you going to do this in the next 6 months, or are you going to do this in the next year? Pretty straightforward as far as a question goes. And if it's measured correctly, it's a nice compromise between focusing on attitudes, and focusing on behaviors, because it does encompass some of that stuff that we were talking about earlier around context, right? So if I train you on pre-registration and I ask you in the next year, do you think you might pre-register one of your studies, or how likely are you to pre-register one of your studies in the next year? That's a nice compromise between saying tracking someone for the next year and seeing if they've pre-registered, or asking them how they feel about pre-registration, right? This is a little bit more concrete than asking them, yeah, I feel pre-registration is great, I think people should do it. But behavioral attention is not behavior, right? I intend to do a lot of things that I don't end up doing throughout my day. Dishes is one of them. As an example, I may intend to do my dishes and then I forget to do them. So behavioral intention is not behavior. And like confidence, behavioral intention can be influenced by things other than training. So if your PI is very much against data sharing, you may not intend to do the behavior, but it's not because you don't think it's important. It's because your PI is not going to let you, right? So there can be other factors at play. And so comparing that to behavior, is this person doing the thing? Funders love seeing evidence of behavior change. This leads a lot to discussions around impact. They love to see evidence of behavior change. A lot of times I don't think funders recognize how difficult it is to measure behavior change, but they love to see evidence of it. And ultimately, this is what we want to affect in the vast majority of our training cases, right? You do want people to share their data, to add preprints, to pre-register, to include positionality statements, to to mentor more effectively, right? You want people to actually do this. So this is the thing that we want to actually affect. And some of it can be measured automatically if you have access to it. So if you have, say, if you collect people's Google Scholar profiles, you can actually go through and see what they publish, right? And see, have they pre-registered the study, right? So you can actually measure some of this stuff fairly automatically over time. However, some considerations, and Lamis, you're correct. It takes time to change behavior, and that is a big, big problem when you're thinking about this in terms of grant cycles and all of that. You may not actually see the behavior that you're wanting to see over time because research, for instance, takes years sometimes to do, right? Not everyone can do research studies that take 6 weeks to collect your data and analyze it and send it out for publication. In fact, that's probably not even remotely close to the norm, right? So it takes time for that behavior to change, especially within a system. And when you're evaluating behavior, when you're actually thinking about the things that people are doing, you need to link that back to your learning objectives, right? Because you're supposed to be teaching them how to do things that will change their behavior. So you need to make sure that you're linking to that very well. So measurement for this varies from difficult, I think is the baseline. It's difficult to measure behavior to very difficult to measure behavior. And then also in team scenarios, right? Which is, I think most science nowadays operates in teams. It may not be big team science where you're doing, multi-site studies, but you're at least working with one or two other people, maybe in a lab. Individual behavior is probably less important than team behavior. What I mean by that is, if you're in a lab and you're on a paper, does it matter that you are the one that fills out the pre-registration and puts it, say, on the OSF or on as predicted? It might not be important that you specifically are the person that filled the pre-registration out, but it is important that your lab or that this particular study is pre-registered. So sometimes you're not actually even measuring individual behavior, you're measuring team behavior or community behavior. And that is also more complicated than measuring whether any one person is doing something. So people love to talk about individuals, but actually a lot of times it's community behavior that we want to change, or it's group behavior, team behavior that we want to change. And of course, the arc of research projects can be really long, right? So there might be a really large delay between your training and then what you actually see, right? So it may, especially when you're training graduate students, people just in general, in my experience, if I'm teaching you about open science, I'm teaching you, say, about data management plans or preprints, you may, if you are in the middle of a project, you may not feel comfortable going, okay, I'm going to move all of my stuff onto the open science framework or onto Zenodo or into ICPSR or whatever. Like, I don't want to move it all into a repository because I've already started this project. I already have a system that works for me. I don't want to lose anything. I will start doing this with my next project. You might not get to your next project until next year, right? So there's a delay even from the start of the next project to end your training. And then, but by the time you see the fruits of that, where they've created a data management plan, they've uploaded it and all of that stuff, there may be an additional delay, right? So because the arc of research projects can be very long, you may not see immediately the change in behavior. And then also just recognizing there's a learning curve to a lot of open science behaviors, right? Pre-registration is something that you get better with over time. Data sharing is something you get better with over time, right? And so, engagement in a behavior is not necessarily an accurate measure of the quality of said behavior. If you look at some of my early pre-registrations that I did, they're not great. They're not great. They're not as good. We know much more about pre-registration now than we did 10 years ago. We know more about what kind of information is important. I know more about the research process than I did 10 years ago. So if if you're measuring the quality of something, that's different than measuring whether somebody is engaging that behavior or not. So you have to be really careful about how you talk about your results as well. And again, yeah, behavior is something that needs to be contextualized. If I only have an hour with you, how much behavior change can I really expect? Versus if I have you guys every week for a year, and we have office hours, and we have assignments, and we have Slack, and we have everything else, right? 1 hour versus extended, you're going to expect more behavior change in that extended time. So, it's really important to contextualize. Some trainings may be so short or maybe so just basic, you want people to understand something. If you're just getting people to understand something, they're not going to get to that behavior change point right away. And I think that that's okay. I actually think it's rather frustrating from an evaluator and from a training perspective, somebody that trains people. I actually think it's really frustrating that funders focus so much on behavior change. It is important, and ultimately it is our goal. But a lot of the communities that we're working with, a lot of the communities you're going to be working with, they're not at that behavior change stage. They're at that I need to understand what's going on stage. And so the focus so much on behavior and behavior change is actually, I think, harmful to a lot of training opportunities because they kind of jump to the behavior stuff before they really get people comfortable with it. So behavior is important. You should probably measure it at some point. Is this the thing that you need to be measuring at this moment? That's really going to depend on your context. So all of this to say, I just said a whole lot at you. But all of this is to say is that there is no perfect way to measure learning or training effectiveness. There's no one way that I can tell you, you need to ask these questions in this order with this wording, and you're going to have the perfect train. There is no perfect way to measure it. So you need to think about what makes sense for your situation, including the resources that you have available. you may not have enough resources to do pre and post test kind of trainings. You may only have, you may not be able to do a survey every time. Maybe it actually makes more sense not to do a survey, but maybe you're doing it via interviews or, in a more informal way. That's also fine if that works for your setting. So think about what makes the most sense for your situation. And then kind of riffing on, you've probably heard the phrase like as open as possible, as closed as necessary. I also like to say as simple as possible, as complex as necessary. So keep it as simple as you can, because the more complex it is, the more you run the risk of participants not responding, to having data that you don't understand, to measuring stuff that just isn't applicable to your training. So keep it as simple as possible. And so I want to take a pause there. I'd love for us to chat. Maybe we can come off mute, or if you're more comfortable with using the chat function, I think that's also fine. But I'm curious, like, now that we've gone through all of these different options, what kinds of things are you interested in knowing about your audience, when they go through your trainings eventually? And I can go back to the, I'm going to do this the faster way, maybe. Go back to just this first slide here that has these. What are you thinking about in terms of the training that you might do in the coming months? What are you hoping to measure?
I think I could go as people are okay, they're already responding. That's good.
You go, but go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Lamis.
Yeah, I think uh, what I really love is that or what I think is satisfaction is important, especially when you're trying to like introduce a really new topic, and topic that is that is controversial. Okay, I'm losing my words, to the population that you're giving it to. Satisfaction is really important, I think, for me.
Yeah. And yeah, I think probably folks should ask at least one satisfaction question. Even if it's as simple as like, would you recommend this training to somebody else? Even if you don't ask anything else, that's a pretty decent, there you get your satisfaction question in. But you can ask, I think, other questions about how acceptable this training was for them. Especially if you're not sure what how this audience is going to feel about the content, can be really, really important. Yeah. Jocelyn? Jocelyn has her hand raised? Or I might be mispronouncing it as well.
Yeah, I think, Jocelyn, if you're trying to talk, you're muted. And we can see that your hand is raised. Ah, maybe it was my mistake.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat, folks are really interested in confidence and knowledge, got satisfaction. You've got a good range. No, that's not a problem. Don't worry. Yeah, so I'm seeing a wide range, and I think part of the reason is, and this is good. I think it's good that there are a lot of differences, because you're probably thinking, what is my audience, right? What am I hoping for? You might also be thinking about your own time scale. So maybe for folks that are like, I'm going to be in this training space for a long time, I'm going to be with this audience for a long time, I can think about behavior then, right? I can think about behavioral intention. I think as trainers, probably we're all interested in people increasing their knowledge. That's why we do trainings. So it is really important for that. But I think, too, especially in this open science, open scholarship space, changing people's attitudes and also increasing their confidence to feel that they can do these practices, that this is something that's not, this esoteric hidden knowledge that nobody has access to. This is for all of us to share, to work together, to make change. I think all of that is particularly important as well. So again, all of these are good things. You're not going to be able to measure all of them at once, not without a lot of resources. So you're going to have to you are going to have to prioritize a bit. And in thinking about how you measure learning, you can do this in a variety of ways. I kind of alluded to this earlier. You can do surveys, right? You can also do self-assessments. You can have people fill out, how confident they are, or to what extent they feel they could successfully engage in something. You can also, depending on what you have access to, if you have an access to like a quizzing sort of software or platform, you can do knowledge self-assessments, right, where people kind of quiz themselves and get feedback. That was one of my favorite things to do when I taught. It also encouraged students to read ahead of time. Is I would give people reading quizzes, but it would be just 10 questions or something. They could take it as many times as they wanted to. And if they got the question wrong, I told them where to look it up. And so that encouraged them to know, okay, I did do this incorrectly. This is where I can find that information. So it also helped to build, I didn't give them the answer, but I showed them how to look that answer up. And so you can also think about some secondary skills that you're wanting people to develop. Some of the more intensive things that you can do, you can have people write essays, right? You can give people tests, you can give people projects. These are things that, if you've been teaching for a while, you're pretty familiar with that. And also, all of us have gone through school, so we know what essays and tests and projects look like. They are more time intensive than just giving somebody a survey. And you want to develop things like rubrics and stuff so that you can fairly evaluate people. And then you can also do informational interviews. So you can, I like to jokingly say that you can also just talk to people. You can just ask them, how was this training for you? What are some things that you would change? What are some things that really worked for you? And you can just talk to people. It doesn't have to be, a survey with so many questions and multiple choice responses and all that. You can just talk to people. So measuring learning can happen in a variety of ways. And so we do have time for this. So I think I'll do this, but I'm gonna talk about it real quick, and then I will and then I'm gonna do the last slide or two, and then maybe we can chat. One of the things that's really important if you're going to be doing assessments of any kind, or evaluations of any kind, is that you make sure that you're measuring all of your learning objectives. So you've come up with 3 to 5 that you have. And so you want to think about how you might actually measure what it is that you're measuring. Some things you might just be interested in, how confident they feel that they're able to do something. But you might actually give someone like an exam or something for some objectives, or you might actually just check, did they do the thing? I want them to post a preprint, right? That's one of my learning objectives. Do they post a preprint? So it doesn't have to be super complicated, but you want to make sure, just like we did when we talked about our activities, you want to make sure that each learning objective has at least one form of assessment. And depending on what the learning objective is, you might have multiple, and that's okay. And it doesn't have to be these 4 things. These are just 4 examples. But you want to make sure every learning objective is measured in some way. And that's why it's really important that your learning objective is written such that it can be observed. So you can't measure everything. So it is important that you prioritize what your goals are. What is the ultimate thing that you want to do? And then you want to think about what you want your trainees to be able to do by the end of the training. So you might have like 6 or 7 learning objectives, but you have 1 or 2 priorities. These are the 2 things that at basic, I want to make sure that they're able to do. And then you also want to consider participants and your own ability to engage in activities. If you only have 30 minutes with them, that's going to look a lot different than if you're teaching a class. And they're expected, and they know that they're expected to do homework, to study, do all these other things. And it's also, I think, really important not to collect data that you won't use. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is it reduces burden on the people who are providing you with that data. If you're not going to use it, don't collect it. But the other thing is sometimes if you, and this is actually related to the next item too, don't collect feedback that you can't act on. An example of this might be if you're this is not related to training, but I would never put on a survey asking people how satisfied they are with their salary if I can't do anything to impact that satisfaction. Because it can set up an expectation that something is going to change, but it may not because you can't act on it. So if you're not going to use that data, if you're not actually interested in the information, don't ask for it. If you can't act on the information, don't ask for it. There may be some things, there are some exceptions to this. You may be interested in their lab culture, for instance, because that could impact their answers to other questions. You can't impact their lab culture, but you may need that information to contextualize. That's, I think, a little bit different than asking people, you know, what would you change about this this training, but you're not planning on changing anything. So don't collect feedback that you're not actually going to be able to act on, or that you're not willing to act on. And then just also remember that training development is an iterative process. And what that means is that it goes over changes over time. So my first version of any training is not the version of the training that I have 2 years in, because we learn more about what's effective for people. We learn more about what information is necessary. Contexts change. So, you know, new legislation is passed, or new initiatives might get brought on by a university. So things change over time, and that is okay. You don't have to get it perfect the first time. And so, yeah, what you do, as long as you do it thoughtfully, is probably fine, is basically the story there. And so I might maybe just give us a second to pause and kind of process some of that information just for a few minutes, and then perhaps we can go into the an activity. And then maybe we don't need to record for that, but we'll go back to the stuff that the learning objectives that you have been using, and think about how you might measure those. So let's first just take a moment to pause, process information. If folks have questions, happy to talk those through. And I know some folks like to use the chat, so I'll give folks a few minutes to type something out if they have a question. Is there anything that's still confusing, or you're not sure if it would be possible in your scenario?
Again, I'll talk as people are processing. I think one of the things that we try to do at RN is after each level of training, we have for each level of training, we have a pre-training and a post-training survey. And we keep telling our trainees that we're not just we're doing these, of course, these surveys to get feedback from you on like your satisfaction, your acquisition of knowledge, or change in thinking, but it's also something for you to like have hands-on training on, since I think we think that this is a good way to go about when you are dealing with your communities, you know, having these pre and post training surveys. So when you do them yourself, I think it also is a good it's a good type of training for people. Yeah. And I hope the trainees would agree.
Yeah, I think one of the, to that point, I think one of the things that has helped me the most in figuring out how to do my own training evaluations is by filling out other people's training evaluations, right? Where you're like, this is kind of a dumb question. I don't like this question, right? And then I can sit there and think about like, why don't I like this question? I don't like this question because it's not relevant, or I don't like this question because I don't think it's measuring anything useful. Why do I not like this question? And so sometimes that can be really helpful to fill out others surveys for that reason. But also, yes, I think too, it's really important to build a rapport with your trainees. Actually, it's kind of funny that we're talking about this now, because at the end of this, you will get a survey from the Center for Open Science asking folks to fill out some questions, and you might recognize some of the stuff that's in this training. So that could be maybe useful for folks to do. But it is really important that I think that trainees also understand that like a person is actually looking at this. I think one of the things that can impact response rates as well is the sense that like I'm doing this evaluation because I have to do this evaluation. Like it's from the like trainer's perspective, where everyone does a training evaluation, so I'm doing a training evaluation. I'm not actually going to look at this. People will not fill out the survey if they feel like they're like, why am I taking the time to fill out the survey if you're not going to take the time and read my feedback? So I think also making it clear that like, no, somebody is actually looking at this. They're taking it seriously, and they're using it to improve what they're doing. It can also be really important too, and thinking about how you say that to your audience is really important as well.
I wanted to add one more thing that I always find like gets the audience engaged is, for example, in the pre-training survey, for example, in the very first session that we had in this training program, the very first thing that we did was one of the questions was, what is your understanding of open science? So in the very first session that we had with the trainees, we projected these results, we showed them like how was the responses distributed. And we also do that at the beginning of each level, where we share with the trainees the sort of the summary of the pre and post survey. For example, and this is what I love about Google Forms, is that it like automatically creates some really nice summaries and graphs. So we do share like these graphs, the before and after, for example, for the understanding. And I feel like this always gets the audience engaged and makes them feel that exactly like what you said, all my responses are being looked at and they are being considered. Yeah.
Yeah. So we get asked to do so many of these, right? I get emails constantly asking me to fill out some survey about something, right? Maybe it's not training, but it's like something. Somebody's asking me every week to fill out a survey. We're inundated with them. So how do you get them to take yours? And I think a big part of that is like, oh, actually someone's looking at this. There's a real person that is learning from me. Is a really important part of that. So yeah, and yeah, pre and post tests, if that works for your audience, that can be really key to evaluating training, and then checking out those that change in knowledge or that change in behavior. One of the things also actually that your comment reminds me of, Thomas, is too, in thinking about behavior change. One of the things that I see people do oftentimes in their first training evaluations that I'll just bring up as something to consider. If you're asking somebody like, have you ever done something at the pre, right? Like, have you ever pre-registered a study? Asking them at the end of the training if they've ever pre-registered. So sometimes people will ask the same exact questions. And that's useful for some questions, but not for past behavior. So what I tend to do is I'll ask people past behavior questions in the pre, and then future behavior questions in the post. So sometimes you may have to modify some of your questions slightly. Because if I'm doing a training on pre-registration and I ask them, have you ever pre-registered to study before the training, and then they spend 2 hours with me, asking them if you ever pre-registered to study at the end of it doesn't make sense because the only thing that's changed is 2 hours, right? They haven't had enough time to actually engage in that behavior. So I like to ask, have you ever done something in the pre, and then will you do something in the post? And I think it's helpful to think about a reasonable time period. So, in the next year, will you pre-register a study? In the next 6 months, will you pre-register and study? Will you ever pre-register a study in your career? Those are all three very different questions. And so helpful to, think that through. What time frame am I actually interested in here? And again, remembering that, especially when you're talking about research, that time frame may be very long. So for research, I think I usually ask in the next year, do you plan on doing something? Because they may be in the middle of a project now, so they might say, no, I'm not planning on doing this in the next 2 months because I'm still working on 3 other projects, right? But a year is like a little bit longer out that they might be able to reasonably say, okay, maybe I start a new project by then, right? So something to consider. So I want to give folks some time to maybe we can work on this together. Maybe we can split into groups of 3 or so as well, and go back to this document that we've been working in. A lot of you have come up with these good training objectives, and I've provided some feedback. And if you've read it, you can click the check mark, and it'll go away. And then for yours, please, not for other people. And then maybe in this last column here, this column 3, I'll share my screen real quick. Share, please, thank you. We've got these learning objectives, and some folks ended up revising theirs. But maybe in this third column, you can start to brainstorm how you might measure. Based on what we've talked about today. And so I will actually put in these measurement things so you can remember. Measurement types. Right. So what are some ways that you might measure the learning objectives that you've come up with? And so maybe you can start in maybe we can split into groups of 3. And kind of brainstorm together and fill that out in that column. Ways that you might measure the things that you've said that you might do for training. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's clear.
Okay. Lana, would you mind breaking folks up into
Yes.
cool? And then we'll give people some time to do this. So maybe we'll come back in about 20 minutes or so, and then talk about what are some things that came up for you while you were coming up with your ideas for how to measure this. And if you want to put specific questions that you might ask, that's totally fine. But you can also just say okay, I think I'd probably want to do an exam for this or something. It could be, as specific as you think would be helpful for you right now.
Okay, I will open the rooms now. So all of you should have a prompt now that would take you to your assigned breakout room. It's good. People are joining.
Excuse me.
No worries, Daniel.
Hi, everyone. I just realized that we are over. In my head, I had this as it's 2 hours, so I'll try to keep the wrap up quick. There were some great points that came up in the groups. One was that evaluation. We've talked about evaluation mostly as like a pre thing and a post thing, but you can also evaluate learning during a training. So you can integrate activities into the training itself, polls and activities and stuff like that as ways to measure what you're doing. And then there also was an interesting comment around almost of scaffolding. So this idea that things build on each other over time, right? So if some of your learning objectives may be, right, just understanding what open data is or understanding what pre-registration is, right? And then your learning objectives kind of build up over time as well. So if somebody needs to know what pre-registration is in order to know what the benefits and drawbacks are, in order to know the steps of how to engage in pre-registration, right? And so those things build up. Your evaluation might also do that of your training, where you start with some stuff that's definitional, but then you build into that behavior stuff over time as your audience becomes more engaged. So I do want to respect your guys' time. I'm really sorry for going over. If folks have questions, I am going to still be in that Slack. I'm happy to answer questions. If folks want me to look at stuff, feel free to send them my way. And then you also should have gotten an email to ask for feedback. I do read all of that. I'm going to give you my pitch that I give, that I encourage you also to give to your trainees. I do read that feedback. I take it very seriously. Please do fill it out. It shouldn't take too long. And I'm here for this community. So if you have questions, if you need feedback, if you want to give feedback, I am here and I'm ready to help out in any way that I can. You guys are doing amazing work. You're doing really important work and work that is often not as valued as it should be. Training is such a key part of this work. So I just really am here. I'm encouraged by your guys's activity during this training, and also the other stuff that you're learning about. This is such a cool opportunity. And I'm really just stoked. I can't wait to see what you guys accomplish. And please do keep me in the loop. And if there's anything that I can do to help you, any resources that I can connect you with, please don't hesitate. I will check that Slack often. So thank you all. Sorry again for going over. Please fill out the quick survey. And if you need any resources, I am here. I'm happy to connect you with folks and with materials. So thanks for being a part of this. And I'll leave it to you, Lamis, to close anything out.
Yeah, it's just a big thank you to you, Crystal, because you and the other trainers, this wouldn't have been possible without you. And I'm so happy that we got you in this training, because you remember me and Emmanuel, we told you, like, you're someone that we feel that have to interact with our trainees and our trainees have to learn from. And we cannot thank you enough for these beautiful sessions that were really, really helpful. And I'm sure each and every one of us will take it into consideration, all what you taught us, when we go and interact with our communities. And I'm definite that this is not the end. We will sure be asking for your help along the way as we go in this journey together. So thank you very much, Crystal.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really intense heart reaction. But yes. So yes, please go out, have fun in your communities, and thank you. And please let me know if you need anything.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you everyone for joining and sticking for more than the intended time, but we thank Crystal for that, for her time as well. And thank you everyone. I will see you next week.
Thank you so much, Lamis.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thanks, Lamis. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Crystal.
Bye.
Bye.
Hello, Lamis.
Hello, Khadija.
Yeah, sorry.
No
I
worries.
don't know, has the calendar been changed? The
No.
documents calendar?
No. Is there an
I-
issue?
I can't seem to find it. So I don't know if there's been
Oh,
a change.
that's really strange. No, it's still in the main folder for the level 3. It's a document, a Google document.
Yes, I can't seem to find it.
But okay, I'll share it with you. No worries. Are you on
Okay.
Slack? Are you active on Slack?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'll send me a reminder on Slack because I keep forgetting everything, and I'll send
You
you
have
the
so
link.
much doing.
Yeah, no worries. And I'll
Okay.
definitely send it. Thank you,
Okay, I'll
Khadija.
do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All
Bye-bye,
right,
everyone.
bye.
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 Bye.